Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kara Caponi. I'm the Chief of Staff to our President and CEO here at ASCOA and have been involved with WHN since I started 8 years ago as an intern. So this is a special initiative here at ASCOA, and as you all know, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we welcome all of you to this interactive workshop with Sarah Kemp from Organon. Before turning over to Sarah, I have just a few quick housekeeping notes. We ask you to turn your cameras on, but keep your mics muted unless you're asking a question. Just as a reminder, today's program is on the record and it's going to be published on our website in the coming days. And we really encourage you to actively participate in today's session. Respond to the poll questions, use the chat to chime in or to ask questions. This really is meant to be interactive, and I think that the more interaction and participation we have, the more fruitful the conversation is going to be. I would also like to just take this opportunity to thank our WHN sponsors, our lead sponsors, Goldman Sachs and Organon, regional sponsors, Apple, Medtronic, and the Microsoft Corporation, and our corporate sponsors, American Tower Corporation, AstraZeneca, and Globant. I also invite you all to tune in to our 10th annual WHN conference tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on ascoa.org. No need to RSVP, and my colleague will share the link to connect in the chat. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's workshop leader, Sarah Kemp. She is an Associate Vice President and Head of Global Women's Health Policy and ESG Strategy at Organon. She has had an illustrious career in the private and public sectors, including time at Merck as an Associate VP in Public Policy for China, Japan, and Emerging Markets. She's also served as Deputy Undersecretary for the International Trade Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And as a career Foreign Commercial Service Officer, she served as the country manager in China and Vietnam and had multiple postings in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Bangkok. Very accomplished indeed. And so with that, I think we might have a small enough group. Sarah, if you'd like to start, we can start with introductions with everyone who's on the call, just with your name.
That would be great. Yeah, if you want to go through as they come up, it would be great to just know who's on the call. And I just want to start by thanking Kara and thanking the Council of the Americas and the Women's Hemispheric Network. I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, if we could go around and just have everyone introduce themselves, that would be fabulous.
Great. So if we could start with Julia Torreblanca from Peru.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julia Torreblanca. I live in Arequipa, Peru, and I work for a mining company called Cerro Verde of Freeport-McMoRan Group. I'm in charge of corporate affairs that includes everything but operations almost. So I'm very interested in today's session. Thank you very much.
Great. How about over to Mary Kate?
Hi, everyone. I'm the Global Policy Fellow on Sarah's team over at Organon. So really just excited to be here and get to hear everyone's discussion. And yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Welcome. Allison.
Hi, my name's Allison Everhart. I'm a managing director and head of the Washington, D.C. office of Nardello & Co. We're an international investigations firm, and I help lead our Latin America work. So I'm interested on the topic and to hear what everyone thinks. Thank you.
Great. Caroline.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Carolini. I work at Mitsubishi Corporation, which is the trade and investment arm of the Mitsubishi Group, covering US, Latin America. And aside from that, I volunteer on our Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. We are in very early stages of implementing a women's resource group. So I'm very interested in this discussion today.
Wonderful. Jennifer. All right, it looks like Jennifer's microphone's not working, but she's our colleague here at ASCUA. She works on our sponsorship team, Jennifer Javier. Over to Edna.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Edna Falla Quintanilla. I'm a director of legal at FedEx Express for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I have Puerto Rico, Caribbean, Central America, and certain areas of South America, pretty much everything except for Mexico and Brazil, which are huge. And I also volunteer for our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I'm the co-chair of our committee for Central America and the Caribbean, and trying to get more involved on gender initiatives. So happy to be here.
Welcome. Over to you, Pia.
Hi everyone, I work at ASCOA. I'm a media relations manager, and I'm just sincerely interested in this topic. I don't work on this, but I'm just interested.
Great, we're happy to have you. Barbara, if you're able to unmute yourself, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am with the Department of State, and I work in the Summit of the Americas team. And we're very interested and excited to engage our private sector stakeholders in the summit process. And I'm excited to hear what everyone contributes today. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. How about Giselle?
Hello, I'm Giselle. I work for PayPal in Latin America as well, and I'm enthusiastic. So I don't have any role in relation to this, but really curious to know what's going on and how can we help.
Wonderful. You do have a role. We'll get to that later. How about Rafael? Rafa. All right, we're going to move on to Professor Maya.
Hello, I'm Steve. I work with Professor Maya. Professor Maya studies women's confidence and communication style, and she's in the third year of a global study.
And she's one of our all-time favorite WHN presenters. We've hosted her several times, so thank you for being on the call. And I see that Rafa has now turned on his camera. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rafa Chavez. I work with Organon. I'm responsible for the policy program in Latin America, but I also oversee sustainable financing and innovative solutions implementations around the world. Great to be here.
Thank you for
Rafa
being
is a
here.
very strong champion and advocate on issues as it relates to the gender data gap. So I want to thank him for his partnership in this.
Wonderful. Just a few more. We have Adela.
Hi, I work in CEMEX in Mexico. I actually work in a social impact area, so it's very related to these topics, and we are one of our main strategic areas inside and in our value chain is actually gender gap.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Maria Sanchez.
Hello, good morning. I am Maria Sanchez Becharan. I am HRBP in Latin America for still other companies. And on top of this, I oversee inclusion, diversity, and equity, and I'm leading in the region Women Leadership Network internally in our company. So yeah, a lot of roles.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that, did I miss anyone? I think we got everyone. Fantastic. So with that, I turn it over to Sarah to get started.
Thanks. Yeah, no, so I hope people have had their caffeine of choice because this is going to be interactive, and we're going to start with some polling just to get you guys warmed up. But I'm so delighted to have such a breadth of expertise in the various industries and companies. I'm really, really impressed. So why don't we tee up the first question, first poll question, please. Dun, dun, dun. So if you could all answer, what percentage of unpaid work globally is done by women? Dun, 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 dun. So put your answers in, hit submit. I don't know how long we're giving this.
Looks like we're going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's see the results.
And the results are, what do people think? Dun, dun, dun.
85?
Do we have the poll results? I know what the answer is, but I'm just curious what the poll results
Here
are.
we
Here we
go.
are. All right. Yay. You guys are all ringers. Yes, the answer is 75%. Great. So 75% of the work, unpaid work around the world is done by women. Okay, second poll question. Dun, dun, dun.
Just going to give a few minutes to queue that up. And while we're waiting, I think we had one more person join us. Jaime, if you don't mind just introducing yourself and the company that you work for in your role.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Jaime Dacaret. I'm the country manager of DHL Express in Chile.
Wonderful.
Welcome.
Thank you for
Thanks
being
for joining.
here. We really do. We have quite a variety of industries, but I think that that's telling. Given the topic, it really does. It touches every one of the sectors represented here today. It has to do with design. And it looks like we have our second poll question ready to go.
So, women are what percent more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash than men? So, answer if you can submit your answer. We're going to give you just a couple seconds to answer this. Dun, dun, dun. Are we closing the poll?
Yep. We've closed the poll. We'll get the results here. And I hope we're going to talk about this more specifically too, as to why.
We are. This is setting up for my remarks. Not that I, purposely did that, but I did. So we had a little more variety on this one, which is interesting. But the actual answer is 47%. So women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash. And it's because of how seatbelts and cars are designed and the gender bias that is in all around us. And I'm going to get to that. We have three more questions we're going to get through. So the next question is very easy. You've got two answers that you can choose from. Are women or men more likely to experience homelessness in their lifetime? So you get to pick one of two choices.
Oh, we rephrased it into a true or false.
Okay.
Women are more likely than men to experience homelessness at some point in their lives. True or false? It was interesting. I mentioned the seatbelt thing to my mom last night. I was talking to her on the phone. I was telling her how excited I was for today's conversation. And it's like she had never even considered it before. It just had never crossed her mind. So I know that we're going to have, I think we'll have a few moments like that today. We're like, I never thought about that.
And the answer is true. Women are more likely to experience homelessness than men. The next question is really one, well, I'll see how you guys formed it, but the question is, what are some significant psychological, physical differences between men and women that have an impact on health? Physiological. What are some physiological differences? And
we're going to take this into the chat now because it's kind of more open-ended. So if you think about the physiological differences between men and women.
Any guesses? Any thoughts? We know, for example, I'll throw out some lung capacity is different between, yep, good job. You put that one out there. Body temperature, yeah. Body temperature, percentage of fat, which has an impact when you try to absorb medicines. It impacts on a cellular level. So men and women's cells are very, very different and they operate differently. And I'm going to talk about that. Life expectancy. Yes, Barbara, absolutely. Women are living longer. Question is why, right? And then our last question, and then we're gonna talk a little bit more. We're gonna I'll say a couple of comments, and then we're gonna really hopefully get into a discussion. So the last question is, what are some everyday items that were designed with men in mind and not women? So can you think of things that from a design function were designed with men in mind and not women. I already said one, which was, you know, the seatbelts, because they were designed for a guy who's 170 pounds and an average height between 5'10" and 6'2", which if you're my size, if you're 5 feet, it means the seatbelt cuts you right at the neck. And in an accident, you're more likely to have more serious injuries to your internal organs and more internal bleeding because of that. Higher cupboards in my kitchen, right? Oh my God, yes, at 5 feet. I'm like, who designs these things? Yes, that's one. Safety boots, exactly. Exactly. Safety boots is another one. Smartphones is one. The width of piano keys, right? If I don't know if there's any piano players, but the width of the keys on a piano were designed with men, not women's hand span in mind. Voice recognition software, right? I don't know about you, but Alexa refuses to listen to me. Voice recognition software, the testing in that was done with men and men's voices. So there's all these different things that are around us on a day-to-day level that really makes it very difficult. So I call this sort of the hidden agenda bias. And again, it impacts everyone. So everyone's got a role. And what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit, share with you some examples, and then really get us into a conversation of what can we do, each of us, because I would argue that every single one of us has a role to play in this. Because in our world, what we measure matters. We are in a world where if you measure it, it matters. Because we build solutions around the data, around measurements, and we track the data to track progress, right? And if we don't have the data, oftentimes resources aren't allocated to that. So data is at the heart of pretty much, I would say, everything we do. What I found shocking when I started digging into this topic was that even the World Health Organization did not disaggregate their data until 2019. So they did not disaggregate their data in 2019. And even now, the UN Women estimates that only 13% of countries around the world have a dedicated budget for collecting and analyzing gender statistics. So why does this matter? Well, because again, when you look at the world was designed with a male physiology in mind, right? And at times, because of that bias, it can be dangerous, as in the example of seatbelts. But I want to give you some other examples of what I call the male design thinking and how it impacts women and how really it impacts society. One example is on women's travel patterns, right? So women's travel patterns, getting on a subway, going to work, coming home, they're more complicated than men. Often women are dropping off kids at school, they're helping parents, they're doing elder care, they're doing grocery shopping. So they aren't a point to point. And when you look at, for example, the public transportation system of most metropolitan cities, when they did the analysis for fares, they did not take that into consideration. So women end up subsidizing more of the public transport system than men. I would also argue when you look at daily life in terms of needs regarding toilets, which can often be a safety issue in some developing countries, but how many of you have been to, I don't know, a play, an event, a concert, and there's those long queues, right? There's the long queues for the bathroom, it's intermission. It does not take a rocket science to say in this instance, we don't need equitable parity in the same number of stalls in the men's and women. Put more women's stalls in, right? It's not that hard to design based on women's needs, right? It is already known. In the workplace, you know, I put up front 75% of the unpaid work is done by women. What's interesting to me is that in 1941, when the GDP formula was being designed, the two men who were designing it hired a woman, a 23-year-old woman named Phyllis Dean, to do some of the observations, some of the calculations. And Phyllis came back and said, hey guys, you know what? You're looking at gross domestic product. We should include the activity of gathering firewood and water in these calculations, because those are economic value added. And the guy said, yeah, no, thanks, but no thanks. And it wasn't included. And I just find that so interesting. There is more discussion now actually coming onto the scene about how do we look at GDP differently? How do we take into consideration the unpaid work that is being done largely by women? But how do we include that in the economic valuing? And as we all know, there is still in many and most countries a significant pay gap between men and women. I talked about design in terms of cars, but I also, even at NASA, right? NASA is a science-based organization, and you would think on a science-based organization, they've figured this out. But in 2019, they canceled their first ever all-women spacewalk. Why? Because there was a lack of medium-sized spacesuits. They had failed to make enough medium-sized spacesuits to make it an all-women's team. So instead, they had to put a man in because they only had large. This to me goes to sort of the systemic. It's just a lack of thinking, right? It's just a lack of design. And then in medical, which is where, you know, Rafa and Mary Kate and I spend our time at Organon, because we are committed to putting women first and to really listening to women's health needs. Where I see a real issue and really also an opportunity. As you sort of heard from the beginning, there's a difference between male and female cells. On a cellular level, they perform differently. And this is an issue not just for women, but it's an issue for everyone because we're losing out on possible new treatments. And an example, I'm going to give you a couple examples. One is up until relatively recently, we didn't understand that heart attacks showed up differently between men and women. We all know the traditional, like, oh, my arm, I'm having a heart attack. That's a very male heart attack. Women's heart attacks, they present very differently. It's also often shows up as fatigue, nausea, cold sweat, heartburn, and it's only been in the relatively last 5 years that this distinction has been acknowledged. And part of the reason for this is that up until 1992, women weren't included in clinical studies. So we don't have that bandwidth of data, of information to drive this. So including equal numbers of men and women in studies, in clinical trials is critically important. And this even goes down to when you do animal trials. What's also interesting, until relatively recently, they were only doing male animals. Now, why, right? Why? Well, partly because the women body and female cells are much more complicated, right? They have the estrogens, they have different interaction of hormones. And so even when you did have women involved in clinical trials and in studies, they only had them involved at the beginning of their menstrual cycle because it was simpler. But we're losing out on possible cures. And why do I say this? Well, there was this very interesting study that was done where they were taking transplanted muscle stem cells and they were trying to regrow them, right? And so they were in the lab and they were studying their study, and the doctors that were doing this were like, I don't know, they're kind of schizophrenic. Some of them regrow, some of them don't. We have no idea why. Until there was a female scientist who came in and said, well, hey, did we slice the data on whether it's a male cell or a female cell? And I said, no, we didn't. And when they did that, they found that was only the female cells that regenerated. So the female muscle cells regenerated. And then they were like, okay, well, why? Well, what they've understood is that it has something to do with the interaction of the estrogen and the hormones. So again, there are interesting new possibilities that can be unlocked when we have the diversity in the clinical trials and in the studies. I also just wanted to say to the point where, you know, there's differences in the simple things as body fat, right? Like if you look at what medicines are recalled and why, there was an interesting study done out of Chicago that showed that a lot of the recalls that are happening of medicine is because the dosing is wrong for women. because it's based on a male 170-pound individual. Women are often smaller. They often have higher body fats, right? And medicines are absorbed into the body fat. So there needs to be sort of a rationalization of looking at even dosing of medicines between men and women. So again, there's lots of reasons why this bias is impacting all of us. And then if you look at AI and you think about, okay, so we're going to this next level of AI. Well, we know already that AI there's been a lot of data gaps because a lot of the studies on AI have been done based on male curriculum, based on the bias that already exists, based on male voices, male recognition of voices. So there was a study where there was an algorithm that was intended to predict heart attacks 5 years before they happen, right? They're going to use AI, they're going to run the numbers, they're going to predict heart attacks 5 years before it's happened. But unfortunately, it goes back to where's the data? The data that they had were predominantly based on men because the clinical trials predominantly have men, not women in it. So what happened? Well, they did this great predictive model and it works for men. It just doesn't work so well for women because women weren't involved in the clinical trials, so they don't have the data. So again, it goes back to, can we solve this gender data gap? Because if we can identify health inequities, we can find new cures, we can better understand the underlying causes, and really develop policy that works for everyone. You know, there was if you haven't read it, I highly recommend everyone reading the book by Carolyn Perez, The Invisible Woman. She has a great line that I'm just going to end with before I really want to get us discussing that says, closing this data gap is both easy and hard. It's easy because it has a very simple solution: collect sex disaggregated data. But it's hard because the gender data gap is not a product of a conspiracy of a group of data scientists. It's simply the result of an everyday bias that affects pretty much all of us, because when we say human, 9 times out of 10, we mean men. But what I really wanted to get us doing, that's sort of just set the stage. Cara, what I'd really love to do is to get a discussion and get some questions going and get people talking from their perspectives.
That's great. And so, yes, thank you for giving us the background there. I put the name of the book and the name of the author there in the chat for anyone who's interested. And so as people kind of get their thoughts together and find the courage to ask your question, you can either drop it into the chat directly, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we'll have the conversation. I guess I'll kick things off though. So I've got a question for Sarah. Well, I'm curious, what sparked this interest in you in the first place? Like why how did this come on your radar? Why did this become an issue and you're like, oh wow, no, this really affects every aspect of life, and obviously there's a professional connection as well. But what was that first spark that got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, so there's been a couple of things along the way. So I will say the first sort of ember, not even a spark. I guess it was a spark before you spark before an ember, whatever it is. The first little insight was when I was working in my previous role in government, and I asked a very simple question: why were there no women in the senior foreign service, or not a parity of women in senior foreign service? And we didn't track it. We had no idea. We did not track how many women at each stage. So I couldn't figure out, like, well, they came in, they did 1 tour, they did 2 tours, they left. Why did they leave? So without the data, we couldn't figure out why there was this inequity at the top. And that was just sort of an, like, oh, well, maybe it's just us, right? So I thought, well, maybe it's just our service. Maybe we just don't know what we're doing. But then what was interesting is I had the fortunate, I was really, really fortunate in that I was working with my counterpart in Canada. And it was during the renegotiation of NAFTA, USMCA. And I have to credit the Undersecretary for International Trade in Canada. She came in and she was like, we are going to look at trade negotiation and trade deals on women specifically and on women industries. And it was a game changer for me because up to then I had not really thought, well, it's trade. We don't really need to do anything. Like, what's this? But they really showed the imbalance of our trading system and the trade treaties that we have around the world, what that impact was. And that for me was sort of the second eye opener of, hey, you know, this does impact all of us. And then finally, I came to Organon and I got the luxury of being able to study this a little bit more. And I read the book Invisible Women and I realized, oh my God, it's surrounding me everywhere I go. And as I tell my boss at Organon, jokingly, I say, you know, I wake up in a little bit of a rage every day because we have to fix this. We have to fix it now. So that's my journey. But I'd love to hear others, what they see.
So does anyone want to share an example of how they see it in their own lives? Pia, are you raising your hand? Yes, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm actually reading the book myself, and I feel the same way. I keep telling everybody about it because it's just everybody has to read it, I think. And what I can see is that this imbalance is everywhere. Like normally I would also think, yeah, in trade, there's no, should we think about what, yeah, it's gender imbalance. So the data gap may be everywhere, but what do you think? So I guess my question is there any industry where there's more development in the data collecting, but also there's the point of using this data? There's the collecting and applying it actually. So is there an industry where there's more advancement? And also, what do you recommend for any organization, big or small, in the collecting and the applying?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Let me start with the second one first. So I think there is a role for every industry, every organization, every individual, and it's from little things such as when you do little things like putting together a panel, do you ensure that women and men are both on the panel, right? It's things of when you do surveys, it's about being intentional about that diversity. And you could argue this is the same thing, whether it's gender diversity or ethnic diversity. Are we being intentional in what we do? You know, if you're doing, I'd love to hear from those on the call that are responsible for diversity and inclusion at their companies and what they're doing in their companies. We at Organon are really taking a very hard look at things like gender pay. Do we have a gender pay gap? What really measuring internally, because we have to walk the walk, right? If we're going to be a women's health company, let's make sure we can walk the walk. And I think it's that kind of introspection at a company level that it starts with that. At an industry level, I am hopeful, particularly in the medical field, in terms of including women in trials, in having more of that data. But again, we've got this deficit, 1992 to now, we've got this deficit that it's going to take time to build up those case studies, to build up that data. But I would really love to hear for those on the call who have diversity and inclusion as part of their remit. What are you doing as it relates to looking at these issues and tracking the gender data gap? Anyone?
Hello. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that I haven't seen this as a data information. We as a DHL, I'm talking about a company, but we know that we are learning. We know that we're just understanding many things, and there's a mindset of equity. There's a mindset of inclusion, you know? and we are implementing different initiatives to do so, you know? Mainly at the leadership women, just to being an example to the rest of the women. So BDPs or examples. So use that to a powerful tool to expand that, you know. But when you talk about data, I mean, this is something that we didn't start yet already. We start with some initiatives to really learn and show the compromise we have and the belief we have on the inclusion and the equity. But from the, and this is my point of view, still we didn't have enough information or data to start making conclusion. As you when you said the belt and many things that you just mentioned, I didn't even think about it. But this it's a key thing, because if you want to do something really powerful, something that really make a change, we need to start collecting data to show, to demonstrate, and to evaluate the impact of any initiative. So again, I'm learning, but I think it's really interesting. And the data part, I haven't think about it. So it is something that we'll include as part of our mindset and our initiatives to reduce the gap of the gender.
Yeah, I'd be curious, just, in your profession and in the transportation profession, when you think about if there are safety incidences, or does it are women injured more than men because maybe they don't have the right equipment, it's not fitted to them, or their physique? What's the overflow? What's the impact of not having a design thinking that takes into the consideration these differences? So yeah, it's an interesting, when you start getting into this rabbit hole, like, it's very, very interesting very quickly. But thank you for sharing that. That's and to the point of, having the ability to have an example. I mean, again, I am incredibly grateful to the leadership at Organon. We have a board that is 70% women. It's the most diverse in terms of gender equity in the S&P 500. So we have 70% of our independent directors are women. And it really does set a tone, I think. We are also a women's health company, so it makes sense. But it does set a tone that I think is very different than the other places that I have worked. So to your point, Jaime, yeah, having that example, leading by example, is I think critical. But others on the phone?
Yeah, in our case, the situation is quite similar. I work for still other companies, so cosmetic industry. Yeah, we are nearly 80% women. So, and I totally agree with you, Sarah, that I used to work before arriving into the cosmetic sector for a finance sector. So my life changed dramatically, switching, sectors, because I moved to a purely male environment to a purely female environment, and then there are differences, like, for example, the temperature in the meeting rooms. And I know that you can know what I'm talking about. Men like to work like in the North Pole, and so it was tough for me. So in our case, I think when there is a mostly women sector or a mostly women company, there is a lot of difference, and we need to work of being inclusive, including all the men. So
Yes.
for this world, this sounds weird, but this is our reality nowadays.
Maria, I completely agree with you, and I would love, I might put Rafa on the spot, because I agree, it is not a male or female, it is all of us that need to show up. And I, again, am incredibly grateful to the support and the advocates and the allies, such as Rafa, that I've experienced on this journey of trying to figure out how do you show up authentically? How do you deal with these gender gap issues? And it's an excellent point, Maria, because I was always freezing in my other. Before I joined Organon, I too would be like, all right, let me bring a bunch of sweaters because I'm going to be the only one that's freezing in here. But Rafa, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Just a quick comment, and it's the fact that it's not only the right thing to do for males, but it's also a smart thing to do in the sense that you can avoid, unnecessary complications, unnecessary accidents. You can avoid unnecessary costs, and so it's not a male female thing. It's really a society. It needs to become a societal approach, in the sense that by investing in generating data that really represents well both males and females, you'll be able to make smarter decisions in simple things that are related to a lot of the things that you do in diversity and inclusion, but also in more pressing and more impactful activities, such as, for example, policy development. So it's the right thing to do, and I completely agree. It's one of those that we need to bring more allies to. Thank you, Sarah. Back to you.
Yeah, no, excellent comments. Others?
If I may, I'm on the opposite spectrum from Oregon or Estelle Lauder, working for Mitsubishi. Has been, a different environment that I was used to. This is the first time I worked for a Japanese firm. So although there are a lot of women in admin roles, when we reach leadership levels, there's the very explicit gap. So when we started this task force last year, sort of jumping on, the private sector wagon, forgive my bluntness, but it was sort of like the blind leading the blind, because none of us had experience on this before. So we decided to start with a company-wide survey to understand where were the gaps, what people, what our employees thought was the most important thing to tackle when it comes to inclusion. And our overwhelming, anonym answer came from the fact that there is a huge gender gap and how women felt like they didn't have the same opportunities as their male counterparts. So that's why we decided to start with the Women Resources Group. Like I said, we can all see the very explicit gaps, but I would love to hear your thoughts, Sarah, and others on the call as well, on how we can go about finding, the hidden gaps that you mentioned, the hidden bias that you mentioned before.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would also love any suggestions from others on the call, but it's really, in my mind, it's what I call the design thinking, right? It's about what Jaime talked about. Like, he hadn't thought about, is there in protective clothes for people that are delivering packages, or in in every aspect of the job descriptions that you have, is there any design thinking that needs to look at it and ensure that there isn't a bias? I'm not entirely sure for Mitsubishi whether it's in, it's what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. But I do think, and I'd be curious to hear from others, that if we could get people to have the design thinking, I think we could go a long way. Again, what does Mitsubishi do when you put together award ceremonies? Who are you awarding? Why are you awarding? What's the categories? Who are you putting on panels? Are you ensuring there's a diversity of views? Are we ensuring there's a diversity in terms of just what people are seeing and reading and thinking about, right? Like, when we had an interesting conversation with one of our partners where we are looking at the impact of low fertility rates on GDP, and we were going to sort of the tried and trusted economists, and we were like, wait a minute, let's get some women economists here to talk about this. And it was very interesting to see the difference in opinions, and just bringing in those different viewpoints, I think, is important. But I'd love to throw that out to others on the call, if you could want to help answer.
Well,
Caroline?
it looks like
Question?
we have a hand raised from Adela.
Yes. Hi. Hi. I also come from mostly men sector, which is Cemex. We are a Mexican company in the cement and concrete business sector. So it's clearly mostly men in our operations. We have operations in over 50 countries, and it's mostly men. And for us, we work very hard in the diversity and inclusion, but there's a huge difference between like the corporate level and the offices and the operations. In our factories, there's a huge difference what you can find in factories, in distribution, shipping, and what you can find or what you can do in our offices. We do have a very excellent diversity and inclusion policy. We have diversity and inclusion commissions in every country we have operations in. We have explicit recruiting process that it's blind CVs, and then blind CVs on the first interviews, and then up to the final 3 candidates, you have to have a woman in the 3 final ones. Also, we have a 50-50% of women and men at entry levels, which is going and which goes lower to women when they go up in the up to management levels. So we need to be working on that more. And talking about data, our human resources area is actually projecting future managers with the women that they have now at entry levels, and analysts looking for potential and to develop women at those levels so they can be completing and fulfilling management levels in like 3 to 5 years. But again, what I feel is that even though we put all these practices right now, we have a huge difference between what we call the offices and the corporate levels and the operations. In most countries we operate in, we have a very cultural influence where you cannot have like a woman driving these big, huge trucks, or women working in a factory, or in a construction field. So it's also not something that the company also does in terms of processes and policies at internal level, but also how do you change culture and this vision that women cannot work in a cement factory or drive in a huge truck.
Yeah, that is the cultural constructs with which you operate within the culture that you live are difficult and can be challenging. I have a question for you. I mean, Cemex is an amazing company. I know that you've done a lot of work. You had anthropologists come in and spend 6 months in the favelas, for example, understanding your client base. And I'm just and redesigning the packaging around sort of that segment of your customers. I'm wondering if what if any segmentation is being done for any women customers? Is that a segmentation of a customer base or not at all? Is it really
Not
your
in terms of products,
okay?
but in terms of our, for example, our value proposition. Yes, we do have programs strictly for women, self-employment, promotion of women capabilities, employability, entrepreneurship, focusing on women. Not the product itself, but how to implement it. Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other thoughts on the cultural question that's been raised? How do you change culture? I think was sort of a summary, a quick summary of that.
Sarah, I think you mentioned it. It might not be necessarily a quick solution, but culture is created when people find ways to solve daily problems, right? So that's when these solutions are brought, and people are happy because it solved them daily problems, then a culture around usage or a culture around behaviors really is established. So in my mind, you alluded about the design of a lot of these things. I'm thinking about the big trucks. I don't see why a woman cannot drive a big truck. You just need to design the location of the cockpit in a way that any person with a certain height and reach in terms of arms and legs and is able to maneuver, because the capability of a woman and of a man to work on machinery is exactly the same. I would argue that women might have better results just because we know that women can focus, can have a detailed focus even higher than most men. So to me, we might be looking at this from a wrong angle. It's really about designing. It's really about testing. It's really about sharing how a woman can be equally and probably more successful in managing a big truck. And then after that, by showing that best practice, by showing that it can be done and that it can actually bring better results, then the culture is created. And so then next time a person thinks about offering, a woman a position as a driver of a big truck, it won't, the bias won't necessarily be as strong as before. So that's why the data becomes so important, because as we bring more of these evidences of these best practices, to the discussion, we will drive change along. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
No, it's a great insight. I would also add, one of the things I would love to see is getting governments to really drive the data, changing the data gap and asking governments to really look at disaggregating data by gender. Again, the fact that there's only 13% of governments around the world have actually a specific program on disaggregating data or making it an issue is to me astounding.
So I want to be mindful, go ahead.
I just wanted to share that another way to change culture into a company and I agree with Rafa, but it's also leading by the example, okay? And it has to do with data, okay? It's related to what Rafa said, but it's very complicated sometimes, okay? And obviously today we are in 2021 when I started working at my company. It was curious to me to see that there were very few people or women that were pregnant, okay, despite their age. Okay, I'm not no discrimination, it's not biased, but that's something that you expected. And by 2001, I became pregnant of my third daughter, okay? I was so scared to tell my boss because by that time, I had already worked several years. I learned that many people didn't have babies because last 2-3 people who had been pregnant had been said, okay, no problem, you take your pregnancy leave, take vacation, we'll see you in 4 months. And when they came back, they were just terminated by the human resources manager at that time. And I'm talking about several years ago. Okay, so when I had to tell my boss almost 20 years ago that I was pregnant, okay, I was so scared. I was more scared than telling my husband that we were having a third child after 7-8 years, okay, from the first 2. So it's very, very interesting to see that once I returned to work, I was not fired, okay? I stayed in the position, so I can prove it with a statistic, okay? Several ladies started having their babies. Okay, so this is something that I wanted to share with you because it's something that impressed me, and I know these times have changed. Okay, yeah. But if I had been dismissed, I believe that those ladies would have not risked their job in exchange of maternity. That's one thing. And having role models, having people in high positions also in the organizations, just like truck drivers, okay, is the same thing because they motivate people and give some objectives like a start for people to say, okay, if she made it, I can make it, right? So just wanted to share those thoughts for you to grab and maybe use in the future. But in Peru, there is a current to try to level the gap. Okay, and in mining, we are 6%, around 6 to 7% women in the mining force. Arequipa is a strange case because we don't have a camp. We are 1 hour away from the mine. So most of my life, I've gone to the mine and came back to home without any issue. But still then, you don't have enough ladies that want to come to work in any position. Okay, and the reason is they are either not interested in engineering, they are not interested in being away from home 10 hours, 11 hours, because including commuting time is around 10 hours that you are away, because someone has to do errands, someone has to pick up children from home, take care of elder parents, or be home just to have lunch served for children or the husband, whatsoever. So just wanted to share some thoughts because it's not only about location of camps. It's something that goes deeper here, at least, in our culture, not only the company's culture, it's our culture. Okay?
It's a good point, and I guess I'll share when I was running in the government, I was running our operations in China, and we had, the federal government has a very, very good family-friendly leave policy. And so women would take their pregnancy leave, maternity leave, no problem. But what I tried to institute was that the men on my staff, when their wives were pregnant, I would be like, yep, and you're taking paternity leave, because this needs to be seen not as a women's issue. This needs to be seen as we are bringing a child into this family and the family is going to support it. And I will admit, I got a little pushback from those that were sort of a generation above me, but it really has changed, at least I think with the next generation coming up, of looking at it as, yeah, you take paternity leave as well. It is supporting the child that's being brought into the family. It's not a woman's issue. So I think, to your point, Julia, we all have a part that we can play, and there's some bit that you can influence. I would argue. I would hope.
Before we wrap up,
I know, Cara, we are almost at time.
We're almost at time. I see one more hand raised, and then we'll enter into your final call to action. So why don't we go over to Susana?
Hi, good evening, Sarah and colleagues. Well, I'm Susana from Organon Central American Caribbean countries. And I wanted to share with you very shortly, the experience of a network here, operating here in this area, called IPG, promoted by the BID, and supported by the governments, the economic and health governments here in different countries, in Panama, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. They are very much focused on analyzing and promoting the equality for women here. Here is the big issue because we really need support to change the culture. These countries are absolutely different from Europe that I know very well, and it's incredible how the same speaking language countries are so different in culture and in opportunities for women. Even the idea of a woman studying and having, opportunities to work is for them something really new, So for me, it's very important, and I wanted to share this information with you in case you will need, that they are working on that. They are analyzing information to national level, but of course, working with company because this is a public-private partnership. Banks and other kind of, companies are developing specific programs to support entrepreneurship and health for women in this part of the world, and they're really interesting how they will evolve. They're starting now only 2-3 years experience, so we will need to wait a bit just to be able to find results, But they're very, very, for me, they're very, something really important for the opportunities here for women. Thank you.
Susanna, that's encouraging, and I'm so pleased to hear that, and I would love to stay in touch and keep track of how things go. To the point that you raised, one startling, I guess it's the last fact and figure I'll leave before we all sign off and get on with our days, but McKinsey did a research, and they found that if we could advance women's equity, our national economies and would grow between 12 and 23 trillion dollars. So between 12 and 23 trillion dollars could be added to global GDP if we could help get equity in terms of men and women in the workforce. Just that one number, just that one, getting men and women to participate at an equal level in the economy. So to your point, it is. I'm pleased to hear that the governments are looking at this, and I would love to stay in touch and hear how it's going or what programs they're devising to ensure that there's equity in the workforce. But with Cara, I see we're at time, so I guess I'm going to throw it back to you and say thank you for this opportunity. As my only thing is, as you can see, you don't have to be an expert, because I'm not an expert, to be involved, to be passionate, to I would say my request is for people to be deliberate and intentional, and to just, as I say it, to think in a design way. Like when you are looking at things, think from a gender equity lens and really use sort of design thinking of how are you going to do something.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation and for leading the conversation, and for everyone on the call who participated. This can seem like a really overwhelming, big topic. This is a global problem. It's at the biggest corporations in the world, and it's at tiny organizations like my own. But I am encouraged because there is something that we can do. I'll share one brief example, and then we could say goodbye. But a few years ago, I took the data, I aggregated, and I looked at who are we giving the microphone to? Who are we hosting for private events and giving that spotlight to? Because that's the power that we have in my organization. And as you can imagine, overwhelmingly, it was to male experts. And so just by putting together the numbers, sharing that with the team, I was able to be like, okay, this is the data, the facts don't lie. Now let's do something about it. So that's a great, that's just my own example of a way to take the data and encourage change to help close the gender gap. So thank Thank you again to Sarah and to Rafa and to the team at Organon. You guys are wonderful to work with. And we hope to see everyone tomorrow at our virtual conference at 3 p.m. Eastern Time at ascua.org. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.